If we get closes below that, 2 weekly closes, then I'll see you next year, right? And the reason I say that is because historically that did mark the end of prior cycles. And so you could imagine a narrative where like Ethereum continues to hold at these levels, then you get the end of the government shutdown sometime in like mid to late November. Ethereum rallies to an all-time high.
거시경제 전문가 벤코엔이 요동치는 현 암호화폐 시장에 대한 날카로운 분석을 내놓았습니다. 암울한 상황에 놓인 현 암호화폐 시장은 과연 어디를 향해 가고 있는 것인지, 과연 지금의 상황은 시즌 종료가 맞는 것인지, 그의 통찰력 있는 분석을 함께 확인해 보시죠.
Is this the end of the cycle? Is that it? Like, have we arrived and that's the end of the cycle?
I mean, I think the end is in the fourth quarter. The question now is, we have to ask ourselves, is the top already behind us, or do we have one more move? I think that there are some optimistic ways to look at the market. I think one of the things I've been on your channel a few times this cycle, and one of the charts that we pulled up a lot was this chart, right? The ROI from the low.
Yes.
And if you look at this cycle compared to the last two cycles, this purple line, like we are pretty far. Like it's not like we're early in the cycle by any stretch of the imagination. But there are other ways to look at it that are more optimistic. If you look at the ROI from the peak and you go peak to peak and you compare this cycle to the 2017 cycle, maybe there still is one final thing, potentially one final move for Bitcoin before the cycle's over. What I'm looking at, Ran, is, I mean, some of these indicators we've talked about forever. Because look, a lot of the major indicators that people have relied on for years don't really seem to be triggering, right? Like if you look at like the Pi cycle top or the terminal price or the MVRVZ score, like whatever you look at, nothing really is screaming that it's the top. But at the same time, you and I both know, I mean, we've been in crypto for a long time at this point, right? You and I both know, like we've seen this rodeo before. We know that normally Bitcoin tops in Q4 of the post-halving year. So what I'm looking for any type of confirmation, like I basically choose to stay optimistic so long as Bitcoin stays above the 50-week moving average, right? So if we get closes below that, 2 weekly closes, then I'll see you next year, right? And the reason I say that is because historically that did mark the end of prior cycles. Any prior drop below that 50-week moving average on weekly closes, the cycle was over at that point. And you can see that it's happened every single time, right? This is, a few cycles ago, and now we're just potentially doing it again. But the good news is that right now we're still above the 50-week moving average, and I think the 50-week SMA is around like 103K. So put it this way, if we get multiple closes below 100K, then the cycle is likely over. Until that time happens, I still think there's some reason to be optimistic.
But even if the cycle's not over, you're saying there could be one last hurrah before the end of the cycle. But you still think that, I mean, you're talking about Q4, there's 9 weeks left in Q4. There's 9 weeks left in this year. Like that's where we're at. So you're saying like best case scenario, there's 9 weeks left of this bull market, and that would be like one big move up. Worst case scenario, we close under the 100 or 103 or whatever that number is or lands up being, and that's the end of the bull market.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at 2017, which there's a lot of similarities between this cycle and 2017, one of the ways to look at that is if you look at the number of days since Bitcoin had a 50% drop, you see how like last cycle there was a lot of volatility where we had frequent 50% drops, and then 3 cycles ago there was a lot of 50% drops. But this cycle, we haven't had 50% drops. It looks a lot like the 2017 cycle, right? Where there was also really low volatility. So I think there's reason to look at this through the lens of what happened in 2017. And one of the things to note, maybe about some other coins, not just Bitcoin, but Ethereum, Ethereum was also kind of doing the exact same thing in 2017 that it's doing now. It was going sideways. It was not moving. It was hanging out just above its bull market support band, and it stayed there until mid-November, right? Like it stayed there until mid-November,
yes,
and it still got one final rally, and then the bear market ensued. So yeah, like I still think it's possible that we get one final move, but that's what I'm hoping for. But I'm just being like open and honest with people. I want to be transparent. If we get any weekly closes, 2 weekly closes in a row below the 50-week moving average, like I'm probably out.
Is there a view that says that maybe the reason why the cycle indicators didn't trigger is because the cycle was driven by institutions, and those cycle indicators, example, the YouTube views, example, like some of the indicators, that they were actually looking at like retail centric indicators, which is what's driven both the other cycles. And in this cycle, it's a completely different cycle driven by completely different capital. And that's why the indicators didn't trigger.
Well, yeah, I think you're probably right. There's two other things I would say. One is that if the cycle's not over, then maybe there is still time for some of those indicators to trigger. Maybe they trigger in December and we're just being impatient, right? Like that is a potential outcome. The other thing is that this entire cycle, and I know this seems kind of crazy, right? But this entire cycle to me has felt like a bigger version of that 2019 move, okay? And let me just explain it really quickly, because I know a lot of people, you can base it around the 4-year cycle, but the monetary policy of this cycle, of this entire 3-year bull market, has been the most similar to what we had in 2019. And what you'll see here is, if you look at the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, and by the way, this is very timely because the Federal Reserve is going to meet later today. And there is a chance that they're going to end quantitative tightening, like they're going to announce the end of it. And what's interesting is that the bull market we had in 2019 is similar to this one in the sense that it was happening during quantitative tightening, right? So you can see that purple line, those are very similar to each other. And the other way that they're similar is that Bitcoin dominance was basically going up the entire time. So you can see the red line, dominance was going up during that bull market, and while quantitative tightening was going on, the same thing has happened this time. So through the lens of monetary policy, you could argue that we're not as frothy because we're still in this like high interest rate environment and still under QT. Again, there's a chance that QT is going to come to an end soon, but I just wanted to put that on your radar because I don't like a lot of people say this cycle feels different, right? Because like altcoins haven't really been moving with Bitcoin. That's exactly what we saw happen in that 2019 bull market. Bitcoin was going up and everything else just continued to lag it.
So would that mean that like if Powell does stop quantitative tightening and he starts quantitative easing and stuff like that, what do you reckon happens to Bitcoin over and altcoins over the period of quantitative neutrality and quantitative easing, assuming that the cycle goes stop quantitative tightening, pause for a while, do nothing, and then at some point start quantitative easing, right? That's like more or less what you'd expect. What would you expect Bitcoin to do at a time like that?
That's a good question. I mean, so let's look at what happened last time, right? Last time it happened, Bitcoin topped out and then it dropped like 50%. And let's just ignore the pandemic because like we're not calling for like a pandemic repeat, right? But let's just ignore the pandemic. Bitcoin essentially dropped 50%. So, if the top ends up happening without euphoria that you and I have seen before, like in 2017 and 2021, if the top happens without euphoria, then you might just get sort of a slower grind down in 2026. Maybe it won't be as bad. And now it would actually still be in line with the idea of you have diminishing returns, but you also have diminishing losses. So you could have a situation where like Bitcoin just ends up like stalling out in 2026 and then starts to slowly go down.
Okay, so what does that mean for like dominance and like, I'm going to call it altcoin season, but let's talk about specifically Bitcoin dominance. If the cycle comes to an end soon or soonish, are you expecting Bitcoin dominance to go like back up to like the 68, 69 level? Like, because it's at 60 now, and I would argue that right now we're still in a bull market. Usually when we go into a bear market, the altcoins sell off much quicker than Bitcoin, which makes the Bitcoin dominance go up. So like, how does the Bitcoin dominance chart play out in a scenario like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. What's really fascinating is, how we were talking about the 2017 cycle. If you look at total two minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, it's October 29th. This valuation of this chart is at the exact same valuation it was at October 29th of 2017. Like, I swear it feels like we're living in a simulation sometimes, because here we are, October 29th, the same exact valuation as today. Back then, what happened is that all Bitcoin pairs had like a small sell-off going into early November, and then there was this massive spike by alt Bitcoin pairs. Like, you see that big spike that we had in November? That, I wonder, if the Fed were to end quantitative tightening, like let's say they come out today and say that QT ends in November, you have your narrative, right? You have your narrative for it right there, that spike. It could be the QT is ending spike. But the thing is even though that's true, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't go lower one more time a little bit after that, right? Like into December, because we both know that usually going into December, that typically favors Bitcoin over altcoins, right? Like in November, you can get bounces by alt Bitcoin pairs, but as you go into December, Bitcoin tends to take back that liquidity. So the narrative essentially writes itself. And I know one thing that I want to bring up is that a lot of times what I've said for the last several years is that last cycle, we did have a major high for Bitcoin dominance when quantitative tightening ended. If you overlay the balance sheet, you can see that when QT ended, Bitcoin dominance found a local top for a while. But technically speaking, the rally that we got at the end of 2020 technically did take Bitcoin dominance to a higher high than the QT end high, right? So technically dominance did go higher. So I could see a scenario where you get a short-term pullback by dominance in November, and it's sort of based around quantitative tightening. I still think liquidity might flow back to Bitcoin, sort of like as you get into the December timeframe, which could send Bitcoin dominance up higher one more time. But then after that, especially as you get out into as you get further out, the bull case for dominance starts to become less clear. Right, the bull case for dominance for the last 3 to 4 years has been obvious, right? We're in high interest rate environment, and we're in quantitative tightening. Just buy Bitcoin and forget about everything else for a few years. But as you get, to looser monetary policy, and as you get into, the end of quantitative tightening, while I still think it makes sense that Bitcoin should be the primary hold, and that and honestly, no one lost money being a Bitcoin maxi long term, I do think that the overwhelming bull case for dominance starts to become less clear as that stuff comes to an end.
Wow, I mean, the way you're describing it sounds like we're living in a movie. It does sound like we're living in a simulation, because it's pretty much playing out like I cannot believe how accurately it's playing out relative to previous cycles. And I don't know, when you showed it on the chart, it kind of struck a chord.
벤코에는 비트코인 사이클이 아직 완전히 종료된 것은 아니지만 마지막 한 번의 상승 가능성이 남아있다고 분석했습니다. 그는 과거 패턴에 따라 비트코인이 보통 반감기 이후 해 4분기에 고점을 찍는다는 점을 강조했는데요. 현재 가격이 50주 이동평균선 위에 있는 한 낙관적인 관점을 유지할 수 있지만 2주 연속 그 아래로 종가가 마감되면 사이클이 끝났다고 판단할 것이라고 밝혔습니다. 또한 그는 이번 강세장이 2019년과 유사하게 양적 긴축 국면에서 발생한 점에 주목하며 만약 연준이 QT를 종료한다면 그것이 마지막 랠리의 촉매제가 될 수 있다고 말했습니다. 그리고 최근 연준은 12월 1일부로 양적 긴축을 종료할 것이라 선언했습니다. 비트코인 도미넌스 역시 2017년과 놀랍도록 유사한 패턴을 보이고 있다고 코엔은 지적했는데요. 11월에는 알트코인의 단기 반등이 있을 수 있지만 12월로 갈수록 비트코인이 다시 유동성을 흡수하면서 도미넌스가 상승할 가능성이 높다고 봤습니다. 다만 통화정책이 완화 국면으로 전환되면 비트코인의 절대적 우위는 점차 약화될 것으로 전망했습니다. 결국 코엔은 이번 사이클을 2017년의 구조와 2019년의 통화정책이 결합된 확장형 사이클로 보고 있으며 연준의 QT가 그 마지막 불꽃을 결정지을 수 있다고 분석했습니다. 그리고 혹시 거래 수수료 절반을 다시 환급받는 방법 아직 모르시나요? 단 5분만 투자하면 평생 수수료 돌려받는 셀퍼럴, 선택이 아닌 필수입니다. 자세한 내용은 영상 더보기란을 확인해 보세요.
Ethereum, do you still see Ethereum as a proxy for altcoins? Or is it like, and what do you think Ethereum is going to do? Because there was once, I mean, I followed some of your tweets. I think you were talking about Ethereum going above 5,000 or something like that. What do you think is the path for Ethereum?
Yeah, so I generally, my general thought process was that it was, it would sweep this high, get a 30% drop, and then basically hold support, around 3,500, I think is what I said on Twitter, or 3,500 or so. It went to 3,400, so I mean, it went a little below that, but it was still about a 30% drop. I'm still hopeful that the market can hold on around these levels. And then by the time you get out to say mid-November, I could see you getting one final rally by Ethereum to potentially another all-time high and hopefully above 5K. What's really interesting is the narratives write themselves, and I don't really think you need a narrative, but the highest probability for the end of the government shutdown, I think right now is mid-November. Like that's what the prediction markets are suggesting is about mid-November for maybe the end of the government shutdown. And so you could imagine a narrative where like Ethereum continues to hold at these levels. Then you get the end of the government shutdown sometime in like mid to late November. Ethereum rallies to an all-time high, but then by the time you get to 2026, all the bad data starts coming in that we were ignoring for Q4, and then you get your 2026 bear market.
How much of an impact do you think this government shutdown's having? Like I know it's not a great thing that the government is shut down. I know it's not really a good thing, but why do you think that markets could run when the government comes back? Like what would happen when the government came back? To me, it feels like, I mean, I guess people care.
Yeah,
it feels like people are quite apathetic about this government shutdown.
It's a narrative, right? Like it's a narrative. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. But if you wanted a narrative to support the idea,
You got it.
a lot of people have not been getting their checks for a month now, right? They haven't been getting paid. So maybe you could argue that once everyone gets paid, they'll just go FOMO into risk assets. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I could see there being some optimism around that, and then we continue to ignore our problems until we just simply cannot ignore them anymore, and then that's probably going to start happening next year.
오늘 영상 도움이 되셨다면 구독, 좋아요 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.